Professor Clover, thank you very much for giving me your time of the day. You're here visiting Los Angeles on a short notice, and you're doing a commencement today. I want to start with your activities. You've been involved with Occupy movement, and you participated in the activities. Can you talk about where Occupy movement is standing right now?
Yes, I think right now it's standing in Taksim Square in Istanbul, but in quite changed form. Let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. I think that the Occupy movement in the US started in many ways with the occupations in universities in the US in 2008, 2009, which had migrated from occupations of universities in Greece and Vienna and other places. So I think of it as a system that's moving around the world. It's a little different each time, and it passed through the American universities, and then it leapt into the squares in New York, in Oakland, and other places in 2011. I don't think that US Occupy movement exists anymore. There's after effects. There's people trying to do things sort of under that brand, with that sense of solidarity or social force. I think it's actually pretty ineffective. But for me, Occupy in the US was an eruption of a global phenomenon of struggle that comes out of economic immiseration, a sense that the current system isn't sustainable anymore, and that, so it comes up and appears in different ways in different places. So what's happening in Turkey right now as we speak, there's been massive and quite militant demonstrations and struggles across Turkey for the last 3 or 4 days. They're a version of it, and what's interesting for me is how they're different. It's not Occupy, it's not the movement of the squares in Spain, it's not any of the other phenomena exactly, but it's related to them. It's part of a global wave. And so where we are is watching it roll around the globe and change in different places from year to year, month to month, and that's dramatic. I wouldn't say exciting, that seems the wrong emotion, but it's dramatic and it's certain to continue.
What do you think unifies all this global Occupy movement? What drives them?
Well, I think that's a harder question than some people might think. We might have said 6 months ago that what drives them is reactions to austerity politics and to various kinds of cuts, various kinds of ways of making the public bear the burdens of economic distress. That's probably not what's happening in Turkey right now, so that seems like a real variation. But in general, global capitalism has been in what I like to refer to as a long crisis since the 1970s. It's disguised it with a series of bubbles, shifting money around the globe, trying to solve its problems. It really hasn't succeeded in doing it. And it entered a new intensification of that in 2007, 2008. And so all the things that we're seeing are various apparitions of that status of struggle, again, of the misery of many, many people around the globe, and the sense that the ways that they've been bought off by the neoliberal state for the last prolonged period of time to sort of purchase the social peace are no longer possible. The state can no longer afford to pacify people with various kinds of social programs, and so this is what unifies them to me as this global crisis.
So in Los Angeles or in US and globally, I think Occupy movement showed its head again through opposition to Monsanto. Last weekend, there was a mass protest globally, 144 nations. Would you like to talk about that, or?
I wouldn't like to talk about it too much since I don't feel expert in it. I think that that's a coming together of two struggles. One is a struggle against corporate domination of people's lives and how not just their lives, but daily life is going to be organized. And the other is a struggle around something like ecological sovereignty, around a sense that people are going to need to seize control, if it's not already too late, of how human life is oriented toward the ecological structures in which it's embedded and in which it creates. And so the coming together of ecological struggles and anti-corporate or anti-capitalist struggles is necessary and inevitable. And I think the Monsanto fight, as best I understand it, is part of that coming together, and I hope that continues.
So, and if you don't mind, we stay on this one more question.
Sure.
So you were part of the as it's known, Davis Dozen.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk about that?
I can talk about it a little, especially now that it's as a legal issue in the past. I teach at University of California, Davis, part of the UC system. We're on the UCLA campus today. And the student union, about 3 or 4 years ago, a branch of US Bank opened up in the student union. I find that slightly pernicious, but even more so is the fact that UC Davis IDs became automatically US Bank debit cards, so that if you were a student and had an ID, you could immediately transform that into a debit card and the bank could start charging you fees. It had a captive audience. I felt it was an intensification of student debt, student exploitation, students' captivity to the sort of alliance of the university and bank, which has been going on for quite some time. So quite a number of people decided to stage a protest, and the protest that was chosen was to blockade the bank and prevent it from conducting any business on campus. That went on for more than 50 days, day after day, and eventually, somewhat to our surprise, the bank branch closed up shop and broke its contract with UC Davis and departed. No one was arrested during the protest, day after day of blockading the bank, but a dozen people did get letters charging them with 21 misdemeanors each, including conspiracy, threatened with 11 years of jail time and extensive fines. It was quite an elaborate case. It dragged on for a long time, but it was also an absurd case, and eventually the university, which is the force driving it, pretty much let it go. We all agreed we would take an infraction, which is like a traffic ticket, and do some community service. We like to think that stopping people from using corporate banks is a community service, but apparently they won't give us credit for those hours. But it's over now, but the struggle against the privatization of the university and the selling of students to finance capital is in no way over, and that needs to continue far more intensely, I think.
Well, thank you. So you mentioned several times that capitalism is facing a lot of difficulties itself since 70s, and are sort of in tune with that to understand it. Where do you think we can go from there now, 2013, capitalism, the way that it's struggling to, like, every penny that we have in our pockets, they want to have it. And how do you think we should overcome this? I know it's a difficult question.
That's the grand question. I might need some coffee for that.
No, but you know what I mean. In a sense, nobody has an answer to the questions. Where do we go from here? And I'm just trying to get ideas to see where do we go and how do we get.
Well, to be honest, I don't really believe in having some sort of systematic or global program. As I said, I think there have been many, many local struggles. Occupy seemed like a grand phenomenon, but it was a series of local struggles, just as what happened in Spain, what's been happening in Greece, what's been happening in Zagreb. All around the globe, there's kinds of local struggles. And I think that tactics and strategies and theory emerge from those struggles. I don't believe in having a theory that explains and dictates what should happen and what people should do. So where do we go from here? I have one sort of simple thought, which is, you know, the worse the economy gets, the more intense is the pressure for us to actually kind of support it in certain ways, to be quite nervous about economic collapse. Of course, economic collapse is very dangerous for many people. We have youth unemployment right in 68% in Greece right now, over 50% across Europe. And given the struggles, the starvation, the hopelessness that this can present, there can be a real urge to want to affirm capitalism and say, well, let's save it a little bit and then go back to struggling against it. And I think the goal is to figure out how not to do that, how not to get trapped into the cycle of affirming the very thing we wish to destroy because it's the only way we know how to survive. And figuring out ways to survive and reproduce ourselves outside of capital while struggling to annihilate it, that seems like the great project. The specific ways people do it, those are already emerging and will continue to emerge. I'm strongly opposed to grand programs for how to do that.
And that brings me to this issue of critical theory.
Yeah.
I think that's a new school of thoughts. Am I right about
New to some. Critical theory is a term that's been floating around since the middle of the 20th century. It's largely existed in universities. It sort of is what became of a certain branch of philosophy. It's a way to try and understand the way the contemporary world is organized. It's mostly has been associated since the 70s, the 60s even, with sort of French high theory, as we say, so Derrida and Deleuze and Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault and so on. What's interesting is that critical theory, which is theories taking a critical approach to the world with an absolute desire to remake it, to change it, and not just to modify it, but to dramatically remake it, that those theories in the last 5 or 10 years have moved away from that sort of French high theory tradition toward a more intensive economic analysis, toward a more concrete study of people's material situations, things like how crisis works, how people live in it, how people respond to it. So critical theory is not itself new, but it's taken, I think, a new turn, or starting to take a new turn in the last few years in parallel with the changing global situation. And so when I teach related courses like this, not always at the university, I generally refer to it as crisis theory, which is an application of critical theory and anything else I know to try and understand the structure and the dynamic and the motion of crisis at both a local and a global level. I'm still learning about this, but for example, I'm teaching a course on this just at a free school in Berlin, and in July they invited me to come. They said, you can sleep on our couch and do a 5-day course, and that sounds great. I haven't had a chance to spend as much time in Germany as I'd like, so I'm going to try and work through that problem with a bunch of comrades there, and hopefully the couch will be comfortable. But that's the kind of work I'm interested in doing. Yeah, absolutely.
So you're talking about philosophy, and there's a what I call a new phenomenon. That's the resurgence of Marx and Marxism.
Yeah.
And do we call it neo-Marxist now, or?
Some people do, in the great name game of the sub-disciplines, you have the post-Marxists, the neo-Marxists, the ortho-Marxists, which are orthodox in Marxism, and everyone sort of stakes out a position. I think I myself am probably somewhat closer to an orthodox Marxist position with a couple important variations, if I can be allowed to elaborate. One is, it's important to remember that Marx's understanding was that each historical moment is different. So to be a Marxist doesn't mean to hold on to an analysis from the 1860s when he wrote Capital, or the 1850s when he was writing his notes for it. It means to try and use his categories and his concepts and his method to understand the contemporary dynamics and how the struggles among capitals, how the dynamic between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, what their current status is, and it's quite different from what it was in 1864, let's say. So being an orthodox-ish Marxist means being in tune with the present, not with the past, and this is a confusion that some people have. The other thing I would say where I might break from Marx or start to differ from his own position, for him, the industrial proletariat was the motor of revolutionary struggle, was the revolutionary subject, but he also had a very subtle and sophisticated account of the way capital has to generate what he called surplus population, people who are not part of the industrial proletariat but who are excluded from the formal economy, who are immiserated, and he saw them not as part of the revolutionary struggle but as sort of sidelined by it and subject to the caprices of capital and of misery and of necessary self-interest. I think that's less true anymore. The issue of surplus population has been increasingly pressing, and I tend to think now that revolutionary struggle is going to feature those people who have been excluded from the formal economy far more intensely than we might have thought it would 100 years ago. So that would be my main difference from sort of orthodox Marxism. But for the most part, I still think his mode of analysis and way of understanding a historical moment and its political economic categories and how they're likely to move is still extremely useful to me.
So is that why you're opposing ideology? And if from what I understand, in a critical theory or neo-Marxist philosophy, they talk about ideology is the principal obstacle of human liberation.
True or false?
True or false?
This has been a very important question, which is to say, Marx forecasts that that capitalism would produce its own gravediggers, as he said, and he seemed to indicate it would happen at a fairly brisk pace. And it hasn't, of course. Capitalism has proved far more durable than it might have seemed it would be in 1820 or 1850. And so attempts to understand why this is the case have often focused on ideology, on the fact that even though we do experience our own subjection, our own immiseration, our own domination at the hands of capital, there's many things that blind us to the true nature of this, so we instead direct our anger or upset in other ways or aren't even aware that we're having it. And so the attempt to explain the failure of revolution via ideology and the mystification of the people has been a very prominent strain for quite some time now. I'm not sure I quite think that. One of the things that's important for me to remember about the dominations of capitalism is that even if they're purely visible, they still are objectively true, which is to say, someone who's without reserves is compelled to show up to work if they want to get a wage to have access to food and shelter. And maybe that's mystified and concealed, and it seems like they're doing it freely because they want to. And what if we strip that away? What if we engage in ideology critique and we reveal the truth of the situation? Well, it's still true. They still are compelled to sell their labor power to stay alive, to keep, body and soul together. So I think that the exposure of ideology is actually a limited struggle. It's the objective compulsions of capitalism remain in place, and it's those that have to be destroyed. Seeing them clearly is an important step, and critical theory has committed itself to that in certain ways. But I'm myself committed not just to exposing the truth of capitalism, but to blowing it up. And that means doing things other than making critical readings of texts, showing that culture reproduces dominant ideologies. We sort of know this by now. I think we have to do things in the streets as well if we want to see the end of capitalism, and there's frankly nothing I'd like to see more.
Global Voices for Justice is a nonprofit media organization. Our mission is to bring to you independent thinkers and analysts who enhance our understanding of the world we live in. Your financial support enables us to achieve our mission. With a minimum $12 contribution, you will receive a copy of this talk. Thank you.